On the 18th of June 1936, Charles Lucky Luciano entered a courtroom in New York. 9 days earlier, he had been convicted of running a sprawling prostitution ring. Now Judge Philip McCook delivered Luciano's sentence. He would serve 30 to 50 years in prison. Ultimately, Luciano served less than 10, but his conviction, release, and subsequent exile to Italy meant that the Luciano crime family became the Genovese crime family. Why was Luciano released early? Who was Vito Genovese, who took over from Luciano? Was this really the most powerful criminal syndicate in 20th century America? This is the story of the Genovese crime family. The Italian Mafia dates back to the early 19th century when groups of criminals in western Sicily began organizing their activities to rob from the rich landlord class that held most of the land in what was then the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies. In ancient times, Sicily had been one of the foremost trading and cultural centers in the Mediterranean world. But by the 19th century, it was extremely poor. These early mafiosi, meaning a man with swagger, stole lemons from the orchards of the wealthier plantation owners at first. By the time Italy was unified in 1861, they were more organized in Sicily and engaged in more than just petty crime. It was also at this time that Italians began departing from the poor and densely populated peninsula in huge numbers. An estimated 15 million people emigrated from Italy between 1861 and 1914. The majority went to either the United States, Canada, Argentina, or Brazil. In America, they congregated in cities like New York, Boston, Buffalo, Philadelphia, and Chicago, and formed massive Italian-American communities there. The first known example of a mafia group in the US was in New Orleans in the 1860s. But it was really in New York that organized crime amongst the Italian-American community became very prominent in the 1890s and 1900s. There, they formed outfits that rivaled and sometimes worked alongside the Irish-American gangs that had dominated the city's underworld since the 1850s, notably the 5 Points Gang. Although individual gangs were organized by the 1900s and 1910s, there was no citywide organization and certainly nothing on a national level. Instead, the push towards a more organized Italian-American mafia, where individual families or outfits coordinated their activities and had different zones of influence, came from the dubious decision by the United States government to try to ban the sale and supply of alcohol via the 18th Amendment to the US Constitution. Prohibition began in January 1920 and lasted down to December 1933. The Luciano crime family, which later became the Genovese crime family, was born out of the criminality and lawlessness which Prohibition gave rise to in the United States during the 1920s. Lucky Luciano, Vito Genovese, and Frank Costello, the three key figures in the Genovese crime family down to the 1960s, were already criminals when Prohibition began in 1920. Luciano was born on the 24th of November 1897 in the village of Leccara Friddi in western Sicily near the city of Palermo. His birth name was Salvatore Lucania. He adopted the name Charles in America after his family crossed the Atlantic to New York City in 1907 when he was 9 years old. By the time Luciano arrived in Manhattan, Francesco Castiglia had been living there for over a decade. He was born in the small hilltop town of Lauropoli in the Calabria region of southern Italy on the 26th of January 1891. His family had emigrated from Italy in phases. Francesco moved with his mother when he was 4 years old. His anglicized name was Frank Costello. The third of the trio, Vito Genovese, was born in Risigliano near Naples in southern Italy on the 21st of November 1897, 3 days before Luciano was born on Sicily. Unlike Luciano and Costello, who were young children when they arrived in New York and who had very little memory of the old country as they grew up. Genovese was 15 years old when his family made the crossing to New York in 1913. Life was not easy for these immigrant families in early 20th century Manhattan. For instance, Costello's father, Luigi, operated a tiny grocery store that sold items through a hatch in East Harlem. By the end of the 1910s, all three men were involved in various criminal activities in Manhattan, from petty crime to gambling. It was an era in which the criminal underworld in New York was diversifying, as the stranglehold which the Irish had held for decades on power there loosened and various Italian and Jewish groups acquired a bigger stake. Then the United States government began to try to ban the sale and supply of alcohol. The Genovese crime family was born out of this decision. Luciano, Genovese, and Costello started the 1920s as minor bootleggers. They became major criminals in New York and the wider East Coast area as a result of Prohibition. There was no single person in charge of the New York underworld at that time, but a loose coalition of individuals who understood that peace was the best way to profit from the extraordinary opportunity Prohibition had created. Arnold Rothstein acted as a kind of organizer of the various gangs that operated in New York throughout this period. A Jewish-American racketeer, gambler, and bootlegger who was born in New York in 1882, he was said to have famously fixed the 1919 World Series. He mentored Luciano, Genovese, Costello, and other younger criminals like Myelansky, a close ally of Luciano's in the 1920s. Although he was not an officially acknowledged boss of bosses of any kind, enough people in the various ethnic gangs in New York accepted Rothstein's mediation on disputes, that a kind of order prevailed even within the chaos of Prohibition. It was different further west in Chicago, where Al Capone turned the city into a more violent Prohibition town. Thus, when Rothstein was shot on the 4th of November 1928, owing to an unpaid debt from a card and dice session in which he lost the astonishing amount of $340,000, it created a power vacuum at the center of New York's criminal sphere. Rothstein died 2 days later from the gunshot wound. Luciano, Genovese, and Costello would emerge as the ultimate victors from the chaos that followed. But it was not a peaceful transition. By the time Rothstein was killed in 1928, Luciano and his closest ally, Myelansky, were already major figures in New York's crime syndicates. Arguably the biggest winner was Joe Masseria, a major Italian-American gangster in the city. Luciano and Lansky moved to ally with Masseria after Rothstein was killed. Another development after Rothstein's death was that his records were leaked, leading to the removal from their positions of a large slew of police officers and city officials who had been on Rothstein's payroll. A new generation of prosecutors replaced them, amongst them Thomas Dewey, later the Republican Party's presidential candidate in 1944 and 1948. He would have a major impact on Luciano's life and the Genovese crime family. That all lay in the future. In the immediate aftermath of Rothstein's murder, a turf war began between Masseria and his allies like Luciano, Genovese, and Costello, and a rival gang boss who had only arrived in New York from the town of Castellamarese in Sicily in 1925, Salvatore Maranzano. The rivalry between Masseria and Maranzano exploded into a full gang war in February 1930, after Luciano and Genovese murdered Gaetano Reina, a former Masseria ally who had joined Maranzano. The Castellamarese War, as it was known, went on for over a year as the Great Depression was setting in and profits were falling. Eventually, Maranzano convinced Luciano to change sides, and on the 15th of April 1931, after the Sicilian met Masseria in a restaurant on Coney Island, Genovese and others entered the premises and killed their old boss. With this, Maranzano became the capo di tutti capi, the boss of bosses in New York, though the city's criminal underworld was also divided up into 5 families or gangs that controlled individual neighborhoods and activities. The alliance between Luciano and his allies on one side and Maranzano on the other did not last long after the end of the Castellamarese War. By the autumn of 1931, tensions between Luciano and he were evident, fueled in part by Maranzano's criticisms of how Luciano, Genovese, and Costello were associating with non-Italians like Lansky. When Maranzano began innocently questioning Luciano about where he lived, Lucky knew that the showdown between them was imminent. He decided to strike first after he received a call from Maranzano in September 1931, suspiciously requesting a meeting with both Luciano and Genovese at his office near Grand Central Station. In response, a group of 4 hitmen hired by Lansky gained access to Maranzano's office and assassinated him on the 10th of September. This placed Luciano in a position of unprecedented power. He could have tried to claim the position of boss of bosses at this juncture. Instead, in order to secure peace between the different groups in New York and beyond, and end the years of bloodshed that had followed from Rothstein's killing, he formed the Commission, an organization whereby the 5 families would collectively decide on matters relating to the Italian-American Mafia in New York. The 5 families at this time were headed by Luciano, Giuseppe Profaci, Thomas Galliano, Vincent Mangano, and Joseph Bonanno. The Luciano crime family would later become known as the Genovese crime family when Genovese took over years later. Each would operate independently of each other, but Luciano had an unofficial seniority amongst them. 2 further seats at the commission were reserved for Chicago, and 1 more figure representing the region around Cleveland, Ohio, and Buffalo. This marked the beginning of the Mafia as a national crime organization, and Luciano, more than any other individual, brought it about. The 5 families enjoyed a brief 2-year golden age between late 1931 and late 1933. The Castellamarese War was over, and a harmonious situation had been created for the first extended period of time since Rothstein's death. Prohibition remained underway as well, and the money kept coming in, though by now everyone at governmental and societal level realized that America's experiment in ending the consumption of alcohol had categorically failed. The 18th Amendment was repealed in December 1933, ending a cash cow for the 5 families and criminals all across America. With the end of the ban on alcohol sales, Luciano and his associates had to find new sources of income. People would increasingly turn to other narcotics, which were already coming into America from the Far East. A new line of supply, the famous French Connection, was built up in the 1930s, sowing the seeds of a trade that would ultimately contribute in an immense way to the decline of the Mafia in the United States. Other ventures that were undertaken to compensate for the end of Prohibition included a further expansion of the family's gambling or bookmaking activities and control over the lottery or numbers racket. Galveston in Texas became a center of Mafia-run gambling in the south of the country, a precursor of sorts to what would happen in Las Vegas after the Second World War. The family was about to enter into a decade of turbulence in the mid-1930s. After an enormous sting operation that involved simultaneous raids on approximately 200 different brothels across New York in February 1936, Luciano was charged with pandering or acting as a pimp. After a short trial, he was sentenced to serve between 30 and 50 years in prison, an especially harsh sentence which substantially exceeded the usual sentence for this crime in the interwar period. With his incarceration, effective power devolved to Genovese, though Luciano established a tradition which would be followed by Genovese and other bosses of the family in decades to come, whereby he remained the formal head of the family even while imprisoned, first in the notorious Sing Sing prison and then at Dannemora in upstate New York. Genovese was a less shrewd boss than Luciano and had been involved in numerous controversies, including the murder in 1934 of Ferdinand Boccia, a fellow gangster whom Genovese owed a large sum of money to as his cut of an operation in which they had swindled $160,000 out of a high-stakes gambler. By 1937, Genovese was fearful that he was going to be prosecuted retroactively for the Boccia murder, and he fled to Italy, leaving Costello in charge of the family. Genovese was living in Italy when the Second World War broke out in September 1939. The entry of the US into the conflict in December 1941 and the planned Allied invasion of Italy in the summer of 1943 saved Luciano from an extended stay in prison. Although historians and mafia experts continue to disagree about the nature of the arrangement, it appears relatively clear that Luciano cut a deal whereby he would use his connections with the Italian Mafia in Sicily and southern Italy to get them to aid the Allied invasion of Italy in the summer and autumn of 1943. In return, Luciano was moved to a more comfortable prison, set up closer to New York City, and after the war he was released and deported, having served less than 10 years of his 30 to 50-year sentence. Luciano arrived at Naples after being deported from the US in February 1946. He was convinced at this early stage that he could continue to oversee the Luciano family in New York from abroad. Cuba, an island which the United States had exercised considerable influence over as a quasi-protectorate since the Spanish-American War of 1898, and in which the Mafia had a major stake as an offshore center of gambling, offered a potential means of doing so. Thus, within a few months, Luciano left Italy and travelled in a circuitous manner via South America and on to Cuba. There, the heads of the 5 families and other associated groups met at the famous Havana Hotel Conference at the Hotel Nacional over the Christmas holidays of 1946. Many different topics were discussed, including the considerable delays to finishing the construction of the Flamingo Hotel in Las Vegas, which was delayed and over budget under the management of Bugsy Siegel. For Luciano and the family, the more substantial issue concerned the management of the family on the ground in New York. Genovese had returned to America after the war ended and wanted to take over where he had left off in 1937, but Costello was determined to remain in control of day-to-day operations. Luciano rejected Genovese's proposal that he should claim the title of boss of bosses and appoint Vito as his representative in New York. Costello would remain in charge instead, and soon transitioned to become the boss in reality. While lip service was paid by all to Luciano's position as head of the family in Havana, after the conference ended, the not-so-lucky Luciano was deported back to Italy after news spread that he was living in Cuba. He would spend the rest of his life back in the old country, dying there in 1962. In New York, Costello continued on as the real head of the Luciano family in the late 1940s and early 1950s. Tensions continued between he and Genovese. Vito was determined to reassert his presence economically and kept a lower profile than he had in the 1930s. He ran freight companies out of the port of New York, operated a waste rags and paper processing company in Manhattan, and, of course, ran various gambling, drug, loan sharking, racketeering, and prostitution businesses. He even operated a dog track down in Virginia that was producing in excess of $1 million a year in profit. His relationship with his wife, Anna, created problems. She had operated a number of clubs in New York during his years in Italy and had petitioned the court for financial support after he returned from Italy, claiming that he had deserted her after he returned home after the war. Worryingly, she suggested at one point that she would make declarations to the New York courts about how he made his money if he didn't offer her greater financial restitution. Their tumultuous relationship resulted in a lot of murmurs amongst mafia members in the early 1950s about how Genovese was generating unwanted attention in a period when law enforcement was starting to look into the connections between organized crime and the labor unions in the context of the Red Scare over communist infiltration of US society. Genovese's disagreements with his estranged wife led to increased friction too between he and Costello, as the courts began looking closely into the sources of revenue that prominent members of the mafia had. In May 1954, Costello was found guilty of tax evasion. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison. An appeal led to this being reduced to approximately 1 year. The entire episode had made Genovese hopeful that he would become boss if Costello went to prison. When this did not materialize, it opened the way for the climax of their long-running rivalry. Genovese moved against Costello after his sentence was reduced and he was released in March 1957. On the 2nd of May 1957, just as Costello was going from his car into his apartment building in Manhattan, a gangster named Vincent Gigante, who Genovese had hired to carry out the hit, walked up and shot Costello. The bullet, though, only grazed Frank's head. In the aftermath of the attempted murder, Costello decided anyway that he was done and renounced control over the family to Vito. He lived down to 1973 in a relatively quiet retirement. A peculiar situation occurred as a result, where the family has become enduringly known as the Genovese crime family, even though it was founded by Luciano. Genovese soon began to act in a way which augured his belief that he was a kind of unofficial boss of bosses. This led to conflict with Albert Anastasia, the boss of the Gambino crime family, who Genovese would arrange the murder of in a barbershop on 7th Avenue in October 1957. Genovese then convened a major meeting of the heads of the 5 families and other leading mafia members at the home of Joseph Barbara in upstate New York on the 14th of November 1957 to confirm his succession to Costello. The house was under observation by the police, and Genovese and over 60 others were arrested and charged with criminal conspiracy. While Genovese dodged conviction on this charge, arguing that he had simply been visiting Barbara to inquire after his health, the net of law enforcement was closing in. In 1958, he was called before a U.S. Senate hearing on illegal labor practices, where he invoked the Fifth Amendment to over 150 questions. 3 days later, on the 7th of July 1958, he was arrested for drug trafficking. On this charge, Genovese was finally found guilty and was sentenced to 15 years in prison at the start of 1959. He began serving his sentence in February 1960 after his appeal failed. He would spend the rest of his life in prison. Genovese was initially sent to prison in Atlanta, Georgia. One of the gangsters who he was serving time with there was Joseph Valachi. Valachi was a member of the Genovese crime family who was slightly younger than the main founding members like Genovese and Luciano. He was born in New York in 1904 and had come up during Prohibition. Genovese and he worked together on numerous occasions, and he had once hired him to kill Stephen France, a man whom Genovese had monitoring his wife Anna for years while he was in Italy. In prison, Valachi's mental state deteriorated and he became convinced that he was going to be killed. In 1962, he decided to turn state's evidence after he had been released and was arrested again on a charge concerning the sale and supply of narcotics. One of the great advantages that the Genovese family and other mafia outfits had in the 1950s was that the FBI and other law enforcement still didn't really know how they operated. They knew there was a vast Italian-American criminal network, but the dynamics of it were unclear. The Valachi hearings in 1963, also known as the McClellan hearings after Senator John L. McClellan of Arkansas, who between 1957 and 1960 had overseen the Senate Select Committee on Improper Activities in Labor and Management, pulled back the veil on the activities of the Italian-American Mafia in the United States for the first time. Valachi not only detailed how Cosa Nostra, the Mafia name meaning our thing, had been established during the Prohibition era, but also how it operated in terms of its role within seemingly legitimate enterprises like control of the labor unions and through widespread racketeering. This was the beginning of what would ultimately end up being a slow decline for the Genovese crime family between the 1960s and 1990s. When Valachi testified in 1963, he identified Vito Genovese as being the closest thing which the Mafia had to a boss of bosses in the post-war era. Nonetheless, Genovese's final years were spent in prison with his health declining. He was moved around to receive medical care and died at a medical prison in Springfield, Missouri on the 14th of February 1969. His years in prison had ensured that the Genovese crime family had largely been operating without his oversight for a long time, and there was a de facto leadership in place without his direct presence in New York. This consisted of a panel of mafioso, including Gerardo Catena and Tommy Eboli. The real power, though, was Philip Lombardo, known as Benny Squint on account of his especially thick glasses. He took over as the head of the Genovese crime family following Vito's death in 1969, becoming the first official head of the family who was actually born in the United States, rather than being an immigrant born in Italy. Lombardo had been sent to prison before for sale and supply of narcotics in the 1940s, and was determined not to go back. He used a number of front bosses to insulate himself from any prosecution, and focused on labor management, racketeering, gambling, and control of the construction unions at a time when the Mafia could still make a lot of money from no-show jobs, where the unions organized for salaries to be paid to people who were employees in name only. As his health declined at the start of the 1980s, Lombardo decided to hand over power and retired in 1981, moving down to Florida, where he died in 1987. Lombardo was succeeded by Vincent the Chin Gigante as the fifth head of the Genovese crime family. Gigante was a much younger mafioso who was born in New York in 1928. As such, he was the first leader of the family who had not grown up against the backdrop of mass Italian migration to early 20th century New York, or served his criminal apprenticeship during Prohibition. Instead, he had started out as a professional boxer in the 1940s, hence his nickname, the Chin. As we have seen, he was the hitman in the attempted assassination of Frank Costello in 1957. 2 years after that, he had been arrested on drug trafficking charges and, ironically, ended up serving part of his sentence in a cell with Vito Genovese. The relationship he formed with the head of the family behind bars meant that he was promoted swiftly through the ranks in the second half of the 1960s after he was released, following 5 years served out of a 7-year sentence. His sphere of control was in Greenwich Village in Lower Manhattan, where he was a capo or captain throughout the period that Lombardo was running the family from his remote headquarters in New Jersey. Already by the late 1960s, Gigante was employing what would subsequently be termed the bathroom defense in order to avoid prosecution. Every morning, he would go for a walk around his neighborhood wearing his bathrobe, looking disheveled and unshaven, and muttering to himself. He was actively cultivating the persona of someone who was psychologically unstable, and even entered a psychiatric unit in 1966, where he was diagnosed as suffering from paranoid schizophrenia. It was highly effective. Gigante was prosecuted on numerous occasions in the late 1960s. Nothing stuck, and his seemingly fractured mental state made it difficult to convince judges that he could really be the mastermind behind one of New York's most prolific criminal outfits. It was, nevertheless, all an act, and when Lombardo retired, Gigante succeeded him. This was heading into a period when mob bosses in New York would need every weapon at their disposal to avoid being sent to prison. Things were changing for the Mafia in the 1980s and into the 1990s. When the US war on drugs had started at the end of the 1960s, it had principally been aimed at the explosion of the use of marijuana and other novel drugs like LSD that were only ever used in much smaller quantities. All of that changed in the 1970s and 1980s as Class A drugs began to flood into America from Colombia. Larger prison sentences were imposed on members of the Mafia, and more mid-ranking mafioso began giving up people higher up the food chain to save themselves. As well as this, New York officials and prosecutors like the attorney for the Southern District and later Mayor Rudy Giuliani began wielding the power of the RICO Act of 1970 more effectively to bring charges against Mafia members for racketeering. Compounding all of these difficulties was the behavior of John Gotti, the head of the Gambino crime family, who was the antithesis of Gigante in the way that he actively courted public notoriety. As the 1980s went on, one member of the five families after another were arrested and sent to prison. Profits declined as the Mafia's stronghold of the labor unions was interrupted, and its independence of action was curtailed. Gigante oversaw a managed decline of the Genovese family in this environment. The family was still powerful, with huge operations in things like illegal gambling, racketeering, construction, and the genuinely unglamorous trade in things like garbage disposal. Meanwhile, he had added extra layers of protection to avoid being arrested. Anthony "Fat Tony" Salerno acted as a front boss of the Genovese crime family after Lombardo retired, even while Gigante was really in charge. That was until 1985, when Salerno was indicted with 8 other bosses from New York in the so-called Mafia Commission trial. He was convicted in 1986 and sentenced to 100 years in prison. His health deteriorated in prison, and he died at the same medical facility for prisoners in 1992 in Missouri, where Genovese had died 23 years earlier. Gigante avoided prison for another decade after Salerno's downfall. He was constantly being prosecuted, but at the same time, he persistently avoided successful prosecution owing to his insanity pleas, coupled with regular stints as a committed inmate of psychiatric facilities. In the end, 2 things brought him down. Beginning in the 1980s, the Genovese crime family engaged in a remarkable scheme whereby they exploited their control over the labor unions to be paid between $1 and $2 for every window that was installed across the city by New York City Housing Association. The 5 families eventually netted in excess of $100 million via this scheme. By the 1990s, it was being investigated, especially Gigante's role in it, while murder charges were brought against him in 1993. Then, several former close allies testified that Gigante's pretensions of insanity were nothing more than a front, albeit, even under normal circumstances, he was capable of being extremely eccentric. Armed with evidence of multiple serious crimes, and with a judge having ruled in 1996 that he was psychologically competent, Gigante went on trial in the summer of 1997. That December, he was sentenced to 12 years in prison. Like Genovese before him, he was determined to continue running the family from prison, which he did until he died on the 19th of December 2005 at the same medical facility in Missouri where Genovese and Salerno had died, and where John Gotti had passed away 3.5 years before Gigante. Like Genovese before him, Gigante had retained official control over the Genovese crime family until his death. Nonetheless, he couldn't run the family from behind bars, and the effective management had moved on from him even before his death. The new official leader was Daniel, the Lion Leo. Leo had risen to prominence as a member of the East Harlem Purple Gang in the 1970s and 1980s, an unaffiliated gang of hitmen and extortionists who developed close ties to the Genovese crime family. Leo was eventually inducted as a made man and rose up the ranks of the Genovese family, but he didn't last long as boss after attaining that position following Gigante's death, despite trying to follow Lombardo's method of living in New Jersey and running operations at a distance through a small number of middlemen. In May 2007, he was arrested and charged with extortion and loan sharking. He took a plea deal early in 2008 and was given a light sentence of 5 years. Later charges resulted in a much longer sentence. However, after cooperating with authorities, he was released in 2013 and decided to retire. Leo was succeeded as head of the Genovese family by Liborio Bani Bellomo, although there was a power vacuum of a kind for a period of time in 2007 and 2008, as Leo's fate remained unclear and Bellomo was in and out of prison himself. All of this attested to the way in which the family was becoming more decentralized in response to its decline, with outfits acting more independently. Indeed, there were many news reports in 2006 that claimed that Bellomo was actually the head of the Genovese family, not Leo. If nothing else, this highlights the extraordinary lengths that the heads of the New York families and the individual outfits were now going to in order to avoid prosecution. Bellomo is believed to be in charge of the family as of the mid-2020s, yet it is a watered-down version of the family with nowhere remotely near the level of influence or wealth that figures like Genovese, Costello and Gigante held in decades gone by. This is not only owing to the decline of the Italian-American Mafia. Since the 1990s, the Italian syndicates have also faced pressure from gangs from the former Soviet and Communist states of Eastern Europe and the Balkans, notably the Russian and Albanian Mafia, while the center of gravity of a lot of organized crime in America shifted in the 1990s and 2000s from cities like New York and Miami to the Sun Belt after the rise of the Sinaloa cartel and other Mexican gangs as the drugs trade moved from the Caribbean to Mexico. In 2025, the Genovese crime family came back into the international headlines again, demonstrating that they remained a force in the American criminal underworld. However, the story simultaneously highlighted the degree to which the family had fallen from the height of its power back in the middle of the 20th century. On the 23rd of October that year, dozens of people associated with the National Basketball Association, including players, former players and coaches, were arrested and charged with playing a role in a highly elaborate sports rigging circle that was operated to a considerable extent by the Genovese crime family in association with the Bonanno and Gambino crime families and other mafia syndicates. The enterprise had also involved the rigging of professional poker games, though the NBA indictments created the biggest stir. Players and coaches alike had been bribed to fix matches, or more subtle things like winning or losing margins or numbers of points scored, so that the criminals involved could bet on the results. The match and game fixing had been going on for at least 6 years in some instances, and even involved an X-ray table for the poker games. This was a sophisticated criminal endeavor that woke America up to the reality of the mafia still being alive and well. Yet, at the very same time, it highlighted the way in which the Genovese crime family had declined. There were millions of dollars involved, but the lengths that were gone to in order to acquire it were extreme for a family that used to control huge sections of New York's underworld, labor unions and port activity. It was a long way from the days of Vincent Gigante, let alone Lucky Luciano, Vito Genovese, or Frank Costello. For almost a full century since the establishment of the Commission in 1931, the Genovese crime family has been the most important of the 5 families of the Italian-American Mafia in New York and New Jersey. This is not entirely surprising when we consider the background of the family. It was initially the crime family of Charles Lucky Luciano, the single most influential man in the creation of the Commission. Luciano's conviction in 1936 meant that power devolved to Vito Genovese, a close associate of Luciano's since the days of Prohibition, and the mob boss that the crime family is named after. The Second World War created a period of internal flux, with Frank Costello in charge, Genovese in exile in Italy, and Luciano being released early from prison under circumstances that are debated to this day. Luciano was exiled to Italy and was never able to regain his influence after the war. Instead, the family descended into a long period of rivalry between Costello and Genovese, from which Genovese emerged victorious. This was the golden age of the Mafia, when profits poured in from around New York and as far away as Las Vegas. Yet the seeds of its decline were being sown at the very same time as the government investigated the structure of the Mafia and how it operated, and as the reliance on the narcotics industry for profits made the five families an even bigger target for the government. That being said, crime families like the Genovese managed to adapt. Vincent Gigante, for instance, developed an elaborate public image of being mentally unstable as a means of ensuring he would not be prosecuted by law enforcement, as well as introducing hierarchical communication systems to make sure that the people at the top were better protected from prosecution. Clearly, it has fallen a long way from the institution which it used to be between the 1930s and 1970s. But, as the match-fixing scandal of 2025 reveals, the Genovese crime family is still alive today, albeit more decentralized, less influential, and often in the shadow of more violent criminal syndicates. It will surely survive in some form beyond the 100-year anniversary of the establishment of the Commission in 2031. What do you think of the Genovese crime family? Do you think they continue to exert a huge amount of influence over the criminal underworld in New York? Or have they been massively depleted since the 1990s and outflanked by more violent gangs? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.